The letter asks that the committee look into whether these materials were properly gathered, whether they were properly masked or unmasked, and properly disseminated, all matters which are within the ordinary course of the committee's responsibilities. We have sent the White House a reply. I am more than willing to come to the White House at the earliest opportunity to review the materials. I did make clear in my letter, however, that it will be ultimately necessary to share these materials with the full committee, and we will need their cooperation as well to work with the agencies who have custody of the original documents. When analyzing questions of whether something is properly the subject of incidental collection or whether it was properly unmasked or the distribution list is appropriate, that is impossible to do without consulting the agencies to find out how the materials were gathered and why there was a need to know in case of any unmasking of names. This is not something that is going to be apparent on the face of the documents. It's also not something that I think either chair or ranking member alone can somehow adjudicate. I did express in my reply to White House counsel, though, my profound concern with the way these materials are being made available to the committee. On the same day that the New York Times broke a story saying that the source of the materials that were provided to our chairman was in fact National Security Council staff, I was informed in a letter from White House counsel that National Security Council staff found these materials in the ordinary course of business. Now, that timing concerns me. If, in fact, the National Security Council staff that discovered these materials reportedly in the ordinary course of business are the same national security staff that provided them to the chairman to be provided to the president, it raised a profound question why they were not directly provided to the White House by the national security staff and instead were provided through a circuitous route involving the chairman. If that was designed to hide the origin of the materials, that raises profound questions about just what the White House is doing that need to be answered. And I have asked the White House for their assistance in answering those questions as well. The third point I want to make, in addition to what will be necessary to answer the questions the White House has asked us to look at in terms of the minimization procedures, we will look into that. We want to find out also if, in fact, these are the same materials or a subset of the same materials earlier provided to the chairman, why that circuitous method, to use a diplomatic term, was employed to provide them to the committee. And finally, I want to make one point very clear as well. This issue is not going to distract us from doing our Russia investigation. If that's the object here, we'll not be successful. We are going to look into everything the Russians did to influence our election. We are not going to be deterred. We're not going to be distracted. Issues of incidental collection are important. They are a part of our ordinary oversight, and we will oversee them. But we are going to get to the bottom of just what the Russians did and how they did it, and whether there was any coordination or collusion with U.S. persons, including those associated with the Trump campaign. That work is going to go on regardless, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Mr. Ranking Member, can you just clarify for us, it says here in the beginning of this letter, in the ordinary course of business, National Security Council staff discovered documents that we believe are responsive to your March 15th letter. You do not know if these are the same documents that the chairman reviewed on White House grounds last week?
Well, none of us have any way of knowing. I think only the White House knows the answer to that question, and we should ask them. I have to say it is highly concerning to me that on the same day that this New York Times story reports, and I don't know whether the New York Times sources are accurate about whether the two people mentioned that story, but the fact that Sean Spicer yesterday had no idea who may have been involved in that review by the chairman, today they suddenly do, raises a lot of very difficult questions for the White House. But again, we need to get to the bottom of whether these same staff that discovered these materials in the ordinary course of business, according to the White House, were trying to use a circuitous method of delivering them back to the president. That obviously would be deeply disturbing.
Mr. Schiff, when you met with
You say that you will not be distracted by all of this, but
that already appears to be the case. Your investigation is effectively ground to a halt because of all of these questions and because of a lot of politics. How can the American public still have confidence in this investigation?
Well, there's no question that there is a cloud over the investigation as a result of the way the materials were provided, if indeed we're talking about the same documents here. What I'm saying is, and I speak for the Democrats on the committee, I hope I speak for the Republicans on the committee, this is too important not to go forward. We are determined to go forward whatever obstacles are put in our way. I've been very frank about what I consider some of the conflicts here. Ultimately, it's up to the Speaker who conducts this investigation on the GOP side. I can only be responsible for what we do on the Democratic side, but we're not going to be distracted. We're going to continue to call witnesses, and we have the representations of the majority that they will support the witnesses that we want to hear before the committee. We're going to go forward. But, as significant as this is now, there's just no way we can allow the investigation to be deterred from the much more important issues at stake. Yes.
When you met with Mr. Nunez today, did he reveal anything about the source of the information, whether the White House had any involvement of getting him onto the White House grounds, or the two names revealed by the New York Times today, Ezra Cohen-Wadnick or Michael Ellis, being involved?
We didn't get into any level of detail on that issue. Our focus during our conversation was how do we go forward in terms of the witnesses that we want to testify? How do we go forward in terms of the hearings that we had scheduled that were canceled and getting the hearings back on track? That was really the length and the breadth of our discussion. As I mentioned earlier, obviously not an easy conversation at the moment, but this work has to go on, and I'm prepared to work with whoever I need to make sure that we get to the bottom line here.
Schiff, I just want to clarify one thing.
Yes.
Is there any impact? Is there any headway in resolving this impasse over bringing Deputy AG Yates or FBI Director Comey back? It's my understanding that you're withholding your signature from a letter inviting Director Comey back as some leverage over scheduling an open hearing. Is there any progress on resolving this impasse?
I wouldn't say we're withholding anything. We signed the letter that the chairman wanted. We've invited Directors Comey and Rogers to come back and testify in closed session. We have also presented a letter for the chairman's signature inviting Sally Yates, Directors Clapper and Brennan to come back. The chairman has yet to sign that letter. I hope that he will. I think that would be certainly in the interests of the public. The White House has made clear now they want Sally Yates to testify. We want Sally Yates to testify. I think she's fully prepared to testify. So the only obstacle at this point is the signature of the chairman, and we hope that we get that.
I want to make sure I understand this correctly. You wrote a letter first, or they wrote a letter to you from the White House counsel?
The White House counsel wrote a letter to us that I think the President's press secretary referred to in his press conference. We received that effectively simultaneous with him announcing it during the press conference. And that letter invited the chair and I to, in response to questions I had raised, to review these materials. But again, we've accepted. I'll go read them. I look forward to it. It is ultimately going to be necessary, if the White House really wants us to answer the questions they've raised, for the full committee to look at this, not just the ranking and chair. And we'll need the support of the agencies, because they will be the repository of information about how the materials were gathered and what the procedures they followed.
And you have a sense of when you would go and do this, and would you do this in the same format as the chairman did? It's a little vague as to what format he saw or what setting at the White House he saw these. Would you do that in the same format, or is that unknown?
Well, again, I have no idea what format the chairman viewed them, or even what materials the chair has viewed. One of the questions I asked the White House in my responsive letter is, are these the same materials? And of course, if these are the same materials, or any subset of them are the same materials, why weren't they presented in a more transparent way to the committee? That's the diplomatic way of putting it. So a lot of unanswered questions. I think the letter that I got from White House counsel certainly raises far more questions than any it answers. And among the most significant questions at the moment is, are these the same White House staff that reportedly discovered them in the ordinary course of business? And if they are, they just walk down the hall or across the plaza, and they can present it to the White House staff or the president himself at any time. So why all the cloak and dagger stuff? And that's something that we need to get to the bottom of. I hope we'll get the White House cooperation on that issue as well.
No timeline when you go down.
Well, I'm ready to go any time, and if
Weekend, Friday?
I'm happy to go tomorrow. If they're ready tomorrow, I'm ready to go tomorrow.
Do you think over the course of his statements on the matter, the chairman has revealed any classified information? And do you think that the House Ethics Committee should be investigating that matter?
I don't know the answer on the classification issue. I don't want any involvement in any ethics questions. I have a investigation to try to run as the minority ranking member, and I'm keeping my focus on that. So that's not an issue I want to get into.
Sir, do you want to
Yeah.
speak to
What came from your conversation with Chairman Nunes? What is the way forward? How do you see it?
Well, we certainly had a hiatus from the hearings this week, but at the same time, the work didn't stop. We were in the process and still are of reviewing, the quite voluminous materials, as well as in developing our witness list, and we have finalized an initial witness list. Now, the way these investigations work, you start out with a set of witnesses that you want to interview first. That leads you to more information to further witnesses, so this is not the last or the final or the comprehensive witness list. But we did discuss about whether we could come to agreement on the witnesses we both want to bring in. And I think that we've made a lot of progress on that score. And at the same time, we had a long discussion about the hearing that was canceled and how to get that hearing scheduled once again. It is my hope that the chairman will reschedule the hearing that he postponed. According to the chair, the only holdup was he wanted to have this closed hearing first. So we'll have the closed hearing first. And that will remove, I think, any obstacle to going forward with the hearing we had already committed to doing.
Is that officially going to happen next week?
I don't know when that will happen.
Mr. Ranking Member, were there any concerns? I know you have talked about Sally Yates and Republicans potentially not wanting her to testify. Are you aware of any other concerns from, say, for example, the CIA as it relates to John Brennan or any of the other witnesses? Has the administration expressed any concerns about them testifying in an open hearing?
No, I'm not aware of any concerns about that. And Directors Clapper and Brennan have testified frequently in open session. And I think Senator King said, quite articulately today, how important it is that this investigation be done not just in private but also in public, because I think he's quite right to point out, if we do this entire investigation in private and ultimately we reach a conclusion, even if we're able to agree on that conclusion, it's not going to have the public's confidence. If they're not part of this investigation, if they're not read into as much as they can be read into, they're not going to have much confidence. It's going to look like some backroom deal. So we really need to be sure that as much of this we can do publicly, we should. Obviously, a lot of it we can't do publicly and of necessity, but there's no reason why Sally Yates can't testify in public. Yeah.
Speaker Ryan said this morning that the chairman Nunes had told him that his source was a whistleblower type person. Did the two people described in the New York Times article sound like whistleblowers to you?
It certainly doesn't sound at all like what I would consider a whistleblower. We have procedures for whistleblowers to come to the committee. When they come to the committee, they are protected. They provide whatever materials or information they have, and they're protected. That procedure wasn't followed here. And if we're talking about not people from the agencies, and again, I don't know whether the Times has it right or has it wrong, but if we're talking about National Security Council staff, they can go to White House counsel. There are already mechanisms and places they can go to share this information. And if the object here was to give it to somebody to give to the president, it makes it all the more bewildering why it wasn't just taken directly to the president, particularly if one of those individuals is the Director of Intelligence at the National Security Council. They have frequent access to the president. They don't need our chairman to deliver something to the president they can deliver themselves. And obviously, so to me, this looks like nothing like a whistleblower case. And again, I think the White House needs to answer, is this instead a case where they wish to effectively launder information through our committee to avoid the true source of the information? That question the White House really needs to answer.
Sir, you say all this to those two individuals?
Yes.
After you met with Chairman Nunes this morning, you said that by the end of the day, you hope to have a finalized witness list. Is that still the case? Do you have anything more to share on that?
You know, I have to say we've been a bit overtaken by events during the day. We have our witness list, they have theirs, so we have exchanged witness lists. My understanding is that there is a lot of common agreement, and we may have something more to say by the end of the day, but frankly, as in every day in this investigation, you wake up and you think it's going to be one kind of day, and it turns out to be quite a different day. So that is something we're still focused on, and we'll try to resolve, if not today, then tomorrow.
Are you taking steps
Sir,
to...
the two individuals mentioned in the New York Times story, does the committee want to speak to those people or interview them in any way, your staff and the minority?
Well, you know, I certainly think that we need to get to the bottom of whether this was some stratagem by the White House. Obviously, that would be deeply concerning to us. And if it's necessary for us to interview these two individuals, then we should do so. But I have to say I'm more than perplexed by how these materials have been put forward and the motivations behind it. And I do think that the White House has a lot of questions to answer. So we're going to do our best to find out.
And why do you think the invitation was extended to you today in the manner that it was, right after the New York Times story came out? Right?
Well, the timing certainly looks fortuitous. And probably more than fortuitous. But per the letter, it said that the ranking member had been asking to review these materials, which of course I have. That suggests, of course, that these are the same materials that the chairman has reviewed. And if that's the case, it begs the question, why all the subterfuge, if that's what it was? Maybe there's an innocent explanation here. I don't understand it, but I hope that they'll have an explanation for just why they've used this path to provide materials to the committee.
But so you're suggesting it, but you're not saying it. I mean, you personally believe the White House has been working with Chairman Nunes to undermine and undercut this investigation.
The only thing I'll say is, again, trying to keep the focus on what's the best route to doing a credible investigation. If there's been a substantial question about whether we can do that, then we need to take whatever steps are necessary to restore credibility to the investigation. I don't want to speak for the chairman. I think you can and have asked him these questions. I do want to try to keep my focus on, okay, what's the path forward here? And to do my best to cordon off any distraction, keep our eyesight on what's truly at stake here. And again, I think this is, I'm sure, quite mystifying to the country. People need to appreciate the context. The context is we had a foreign power intervene in our election. This is not about whether that was decisive or not. It doesn't matter. They intervened in a very significant way. Our intelligence community has concluded, not Democrats or not Republicans, but the entire intelligence community, the Russians will do this again, and indeed are doing it right now in Europe. We need to understand what they've done here. We need to understand if they had help of U.S. persons here. That is the mission. The rest may be important, but that is the mission. And I'm going to do my best to keep my focus on that mission. When we run into obstacles, and we ran into a huge obstacle this week with all of this, I want to be candid about whether I think it poses a problem in terms of the credibility of our investigation, and it has. But at the same time, I want to keep it as laser-like a focus as I can on making sure that we get the investigation done.
Can the credibility be restored?
Yes.
The Times report said that these communications were between two foreign targets. What effect do you think that could have on the chairman's allegations?
I don't know whether, I don't know anything about the materials yet, so I'm not in a position to say whether these were intercepts between foreign parties. I just don't know. I don't even know if these are intercepts. So again, I'm in the either enviable or unenviable position of not knowing what these materials are. But I think people need to understand the process of figuring out how these were collected, whether properly collected, whether properly disseminated, whether properly masked or unmasked. We look at these kind of issues all the time. This is not new for our committee, which is why it makes it so unusual, irregular, that it would be presented to us in this way. This is within our ordinary wheelhouse. There is a proper way to put this before the committee. That certainly was not followed here. And the White House ought to explain why that wasn't followed here. But there is a good way to answer these questions, and we will do our best to answer these questions. But we will not lose sight of the Russia investigation, and we are going to keep focus on that. Yes?
Has there been any uptick in attacks on your or your staffers' computers or IT